Hi, my name is Pratik Nyaupane. I'm a recent graduate of Arizona State University, and I want to share a little bit about my research regarding the exploitation of labor in Qatar, specifically how Nepali laborers have been victimized in preparation for the 2022 FIFA Men's World Cup. So in 2010, Qatar was awarded the bid for the 2022 FIFA World Cup, surrounded by a lot of controversy, uncertainty, allegations of bribery, corruption, all that sorts of stuff. It seemed like a very unseemly kind of event, considering Qatar wasn't really known for having a lot of stadiums or infrastructure for football. And Qatar isn't particularly known as a country with a rich history of football compared to other countries that were also bidding for the for being the host. And also in the summer months when the World Cup is usually played, it presented unplayable conditions due to the heat for not only players but also for fans as well as laborers to be working. And so as years progressed, reports started coming out that migrant workers were being subject to abusive behaviors. They were being denied pay, denied basic things like housing, water, healthcare, that type of stuff. And then also they were being reported that the passports were being confiscated. And so them being migrant workers in a foreign land, that became very problematic as without your passport, you do not have a lot of rights and freedoms. And so essentially right now, the projected death toll of workers is 4,000 by the time the ball is kicked off in 2022. So what you see on the screen here is a graphic of how the kafala system works. The kafala system is the system in place which kind of is the governing labor laws in Qatar, as well as many other countries in the Persian Gulf. So the sponsor or employer issues a visa and a kind of working permit. And so after the employer brings in the employee, they have all the rights kind of authoritatively to the worker. And so the worker cannot leave, they cannot switch their jobs, anything like that. And so what that does is it allows an unchecked power for the employer or sponsor to kind of abuse the worker, not pay them, put them through kind of unsafe conditions. And so that's how all these problems usually come to be. And so I kind of want to focus specifically on Nepali migrant laborers. And so this is really interesting because Nepal's unemployment rates are over 40%, almost half of the country. And so many workers in Nepal have no other choice but to look abroad for employment. And so the Department of Foreign Employment in Nepal has issued over 3.5 million work permits. And so that's not only to Qatar, but Qatar is the most popular destination for Nepali workers. Additionally, this chart on the screen shows that Nepalis actually make up the second highest national group in Qatar, actually more than Qatari natives themselves. And lastly, 1/3 of Nepal's GDP is remittances. And so that shows that Nepal's economy heavily relies on workers going abroad to work and sending money back into Nepal. So for this research, I used a case study approach. I interviewed several migrant workers, government officials, as well as a journalist with expertise on this topic. And so using the responses, I utilized a grounded theory approach and came up with compartmentalized findings. And so one of those kind of focus on Nepali labor for the World Cup and how that has been set up as a capitalistic business model for profit. Over $200 billion in development have or will be gone in for the World Cup by the end of kind of the construction phase. And so this graphic actually shows that just from 2010 to 2018, since the bid was announced, Qatar's population has increased by 1 million, almost doubling. And so that kind of just showing how important and how big this has been for the economy, for kind of the growth in general of Qatar. Ultimately, this has been a huge business, not only for Qatar, but as Nepal as well. The airline companies don't make as much money if they're not migrant workers traveling. The health insurance companies in Nepal do not make as much money if the migrant workers are not getting their checkups in order to go to Qatar. And obviously, the banks and money transfer companies rely on the remittances and all of that. And ultimately, at the end of it all, the government taxes it and makes money off of that. And so, just to back up a little bit and explain how this works, usually a migrant worker goes through the manpower company, which is like the middle person during the hiring process. And so the manpower company, there's about 750 of them in Nepal, charge migrant workers anywhere from around $1,000 to $2,000, and kind of negotiate and deal with all of the, the compliance, legal, immigration issues and all of that. And so that's usually where it starts off being very problematic. Some of the respondents during my research actually claimed that they were issued fraudulent visas after being charged $2,700. And so as usually I'm talking to these migrant workers, they have realized that they are being taken advantage of because these manpower companies will oftentimes scam or exploit the workers. The Nepali government also is kind of adding fuel to the fire. The Department of Foreign Employment in Nepal is the department that overlooks all of these affairs dealing with migrant labor, and they issue the work permits as well as handle complaints. And so just in 2017, they processed over 2,000 complaints with not really resolving any of them. And so part of my research was actually observing how Department of Foreign Employment deals with things. If there's a migrant worker that comes in, wants something to be resolved with, usually ends up with chaos, screaming and shouting. Usually the officers talking down to these individuals that have had a lot of problems and being exploited. And so this has been anything but remedial by the Nepali government itself. And at the end of it all, the government really has no incentive to protect its citizens. These individuals are extremely disenfranchised. And so they honestly believe that even though there's all of these threats and dangers posed in traveling to Qatar or other kind of international places to work, Nepal has nothing better to offer. And kind of as explained earlier, the economy is heavily dependent on exporting labor. And so Nepal needs that for their economy to kind of improve. And so once workers come back, there are kind of funds or compensation set in place. There's a foreign employment fund with over $50 million accumulated over the past decade, but honestly, not a lot of that has been seen to be utilized. And actually, there's a lot of allegations of corruption of like politicians actually using those to go on vacations and whatnot. And so a lot of these things haven't really been proven to be effective. And also, it's really important to realize that there is a lack of regulation because these manpower companies are often sometimes small companies, but a lot of times big, large, powerful corporations with special interests. And so they prey on the vulnerability of these people that are often low income, low socioeconomic status, that aren't always literate, not very well educated. And so they don't fully understand the importance of receipts or signing fraudulent things or faulty documents and whatnot. And so that's oftentimes another issue they often face. So the treatment of migrant workers obviously is kind of the big issue here. What we see is withheld pay, sometimes no pay at all, passport confiscation, unhygienic labor camps. One of the laborers that I interviewed, he mentioned that one of the worst parts of this entire experience was sharing a toilet with dozens of other men, which can be extremely unhygienic and unsafe. One of the laborers actually mentioned that during an accident where he witnessed with his own eyes a worker actually being killed by construction equipment, the first thing the company did was confiscate their phones so that they couldn't record or kind of leak or share this information to the public. What's interesting is none of these participants blame the Qatari companies, and so that's kind of goes to do with the vulnerability of these people. They don't necessarily realize how exploitative the system is when that's kind of all that they know. And so Qatar has claimed to abolish the kafala system, but not much has improved. It seems to be much more lip service than anything else. A little bit more about passport confiscation. So, of the 7 people that were interviewed for this case study, 6 of them did mention that they had their passports confiscated, which is kind of a gross abuse of power, considering this passport is extremely important when in a foreign land because it allows autonomy, rights, mobility, and other freedoms. And so, when asked about these, they're usually not alarmed or worried because they don't know that the employers are doing this to exploit them a lot of the times. However, one of the laborers did mention that he thinks that they do it because so that the workers don't run away. And so that's kind of like the realization that people are coming to. So we talked about kind of the problem of not being paid. And so that's obviously a huge issue. So actually what's specifically happening is the Nepali government set a minimum wage for Nepali workers to earn in Qatar, but Qatar's minimum wage is much less. And so what the manpower company will do is claim on the offer letter that the worker is getting paid more so that the Nepali government approves the permit, whereas the Qatari government only gives them, an extremely lower wage. And so when they go, they are getting paid much less than they were promised, and it becomes an issue. And also a lot of the times Qatari companies will pay in cash in order to kind of get out of issues because payments cannot be tracked. And so ultimately what that is these kind of powerful institutions using financial leverage to exploit this unjust power dynamic. And so lastly, I kind of want to talk about the role of media and culture in this entire crisis. There's been a normalization of death and this crisis in Nepali culture and society recently. We've seen actually a lot of hit songs and movies and music videos talk about these issues and kind of almost bring them to light, but I don't know if that has been really effective at all, actually. A few songs, Galbandi, Bolamaya, Sinely, are actually stories of young couples' loves, like navigating through, the husband or boyfriend going off to work in the Gulf, maybe coming back, dead or something like that. And so that kind of does call into question the commodification of the crisis. Actually, on my screen is a clip from the music video of the coffin and the people of the village surrounding it. And so it's a serious issue because not much has been done about it. And so that ultimately kind of leads to the idea of fatalism. And so obviously Nepal being a predominantly Hindu country where the caste system is still very much prevalent kind of leads to people being dismissive due to it may be that person's fate to die anyways. Usually, as mentioned, these people are lower caste, lower socioeconomic status. And so the response is that person would have died anyways, or it was kind of in their fate. So ultimately, this issue is extremely complex. There is no one solution. Obviously, the change of the outlook of the Nepali public isn't very hopeful or optimistic. The economy is fragile, so it very much relies on Nepali migrant workers. Obviously, societal norms have a very fatalist viewpoint, and there's no accountability for the manpower companies. This was actually kind of mentioned in passing at the Department of Foreign Employment, but each flight from the Gulf brings back 3 corpses, which is a daunting statistic. And actually the picture on the right is a picture I took when returning from my field work in Kathmandu. And actually, so oftentimes at an airport, the immigration line will have 2 lines, which is, foreign nationals and, the Nepali nationals for that country. But Nepal's airport actually had a 3rd line, which reads migrant workers. And that line actually was the longest line. And so that kind of just, cements the, how large and how big, the issue of foreign employment and how many people really are going. So in terms of interventions, we have seen some sort of progress or attempts. So the 2019 FIFA Club World Cup, the CEO of Liverpool Football Club, he called for a full transparency and investigation due to pressure of fans and other kind of influences in the footballing world. Not too much has come out of it, rather than just, again, lip service. Ultimately, it's important to notice that whenever we see, the beautiful game being played, it is a celebration at a graveyard. So many people lost their lives there for, what is often referred to as the beautiful game. Um, Hopefully we see some accountability. There have been mentions of like a boycott if powerful countries or even powerful football players claim to boycott due to the atrocities faced, as well as oversight, accountability when it comes to FIFA, Qatar's handling of what's going on. And so the Nepali government, ultimately, it's difficult for their end as well. There's a lot of the times we see a corrupt political system that often doesn't serve the public interests. And so one of the last questions I would often ask during the interview phase was, if someone had the opportunity to go, would you recommend them to pursue and go through the same stuff you did? And they would often say, yeah, it's kind of the best option there is. Thank you.